Hello everyone, I hope you've all had a really good break and you're ready to start the second semester. We're going to do lots of exciting stuff, and the first of these is an experimental report. So I'm going to tell you in this video how to do it. So what do you have to do? Well, we are going to do an experiment in the first week of term, in the first week of the practicals. So what you have to do after that is to write up so why we did it, how we did it, what we found, and what that means. The experiment is going to be about heuristics, which is a topic that you will learn more about in that week. But at the end of this video, I'll also give you some references that you can look up yourself. When do you have to do it? Well, as I said, we will be collecting the data in the first practical. We will also be doing graphs in that practical. The week after, we will be analyzing the data and quite a lot of the making of the graphs and doing part of the discussion and the method we will actually be doing in class. So if you write a lot of notes about that, then you will be able to do that at home quite easily. So collecting data on 28th of January, and your report is due in by the week beginning the 11th of February, before midnight on the day of your practical. So if that's on Monday, then your deadline will be the 11th of February. If it's on Tuesday, it's the 12th, and so forth. Why do you have to do it? We've got some really good reasons why you have to do this. There are two broad reasons. One has to do with this idea of the community of practice. Writing reports is something that all researchers do. They don't call it reports, they call it research articles, and they try to publish them. You only have to submit them to turn it in. But it's essentially the same process, and research articles and experimental reports, they've got the same basic structure. So you will be doing exactly what researchers do. So it's that. And then the other reason is pedagogical. Writing a research report addresses all of the learning outcomes in one go. In order to be able to write a research report properly, you have to be able to do a lot of other things. So I'll show you this. You will be seeing this diagram a lot. As you probably know, I love diagrams. I'm quite a visual person. I love drawing arrows and boxes and stuff. But here, so at the bottom, that's what we did last semester. I call that the foundation stones. They were all the skills and the knowledge that you need for the next step. So you learned how to find articles. First of all, you probably now can't imagine that there was once a time you didn't know how to do that, but now you do. Finding articles, understanding what's in them in terms of where to find what, understanding certain terminology, being able to summarize them. You learned how to do that as well, and being able to evaluate them, the strengths and weaknesses. You did that in the critical review. And also being able to communicate your ideas, writing about it, speaking about it. So those skills we're going to build on this time. First of all, experimental report 1. That's the first step on the journey. So this first experiment, you'll be given quite a lot of the information that you need to put in. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But after you've done that once, we'll then ask you to design your own experiment, your own materials, and analyze the data and write it up yourself. Now when you've done that, and probably during the process of doing that, you will start to evaluate your experiment. What went well, and what should we do differently next time? And in the light of that, and being able to relate your findings to what other people have found. And once you've done that, setting up your next experiment, and so forth, and then the cycle starts. So that's the cycle of inquiry. We'll look at that. And that's exactly what happens out in the field of psychological science. This almost answers the second question. Why do we have to write 2 reports? Why don't we just write 1? Well, up until last year, students only wrote 1 report right at the end of the second semester. And both they and I felt that they could actually do with some practice. Instead of just 1, why not have 2 and let the first one be almost like a practice round? So that's why we introduced a second report. So you get plenty of practice. I call it feed forward and not feedback, because the feedback that you get on your first report helps you going forward, helps you do better on the next one. And that's why the first one only counts for 20% and the second one 35%. It wouldn't be fair if the first one counted the same way, because the first one you're still learning how to do it. The data are collected by the tutor, also analyzed by the tutor. They show you on the whiteboard how they analyze those data, so you will be given that to put in. You're learning from that. So then in the second one, once you've seen that, you've written it, you've got some feedback or feed forward on it, you can show us what you've learned. You can show us how you've developed. So that learning process, that's the other, so 15% if you like, that can have more of an impact on your grade. So you collect your own data. That's really cool. You analyze them yourself as well. But you get plenty of support with that. Don't worry that we'll just drop you in the deep end. We're doing that in class, and if you struggle, a tutor will help you. So you leave the class with your own data that you can put in your report. So absolutely no cause to worry about anything whatsoever. It's fun. What should it look like? What does a report look like? Well, of course, scientific articles are like reports. So they're good. If you've read those already, when you have, that'll give you a good idea. But if you want a more specific example, have a look at the Morling book. Depending on which version you have, it's either page 505 or 507. That'll give you exactly what to do in a report. It shows you an APA style experimental lab report. So use that as a guide if you want to know just what it looks like. I've also got some pointers, a checklist with things that should be in there so you can tick them off. So in general, it's got this sort of structure. It starts with an abstract, which is a summary of everything. Then you've got an introduction, methods, results, discussion, references, and sometimes an appendix. So these are guideline word counts. So the higher number, that is the upper limit. But it's okay if you're under that, or if you haven't used that many words in the introduction, you want to use more words in the discussion. As long as when you add up all the high numbers, as long as you stay under that. I hope that makes sense. So the report structure. How does it actually, what's the purpose of each part? So as I said, the abstract is just a summary of everything. I'll tell you in a minute what that's about. In the introduction, you start with something that captures the audience's interest. A real life phenomenon that everyone knows about. They should be able to open your report and go, I understand what this is about. And it ends with something about your particular experiment. The nitty-gritty, how are you going to test this, and what do you predict? So it starts broad and then it narrows. So then you're in this narrow bit in the middle with the method and the results. So the method, that's where you give the recipe of your experiment. and it needs to include so many details that other people can replicate it. So you need to talk about stimuli, your participants, what you did on the day, etc. And then still in this narrow part, you talk about your results. And the results, in this case, in your case of your reports, are quite brief. It just includes a graph and a short paragraph about a t-test. That's the data analysis methods that we use. And when you've done that, and that's all quite short, then you'll come to the discussion, and I always find that's the most interesting part of a report. I love writing discussions. You start narrow, so you talk about your data and how they relate to the hypothesis. Did you find support for your hypothesis or not? And then you start broadening out a bit. How does that actually relate to those studies that I mentioned in the introduction? And then finally, how does that relate back to that real life phenomenon, that interesting thing that I mentioned in the introduction? You start broad, then you go narrow, and then you end broad as well. So a bit of specifics now about each section. So in the introduction, the whole point of the introduction is to persuade the reader that your experiment was worth doing. There needs to be a purpose. The purpose of the experiment needs to shout off the page, if you like. So you need to talk about, obviously, the subject that you're going to investigate. You need to refer to relevant studies. You need to give an overview of how that study was done, I mean your study, and what the hypothesis was, or hypotheses if you've got more than one. And it needs to be in a particular structure. It helps to think of it as a V shape. So you start your introduction with something brief that captures your audience's interest. So in this case, it's about heuristics and about assignment marking. I think it's a topic you'll find really interesting. And there's a lot of sort of anecdotal stuff that you can say about that. We'll do some brainstorming in class on how you might start your report. Once you've given that general sort of eye-catching introduction, you then become a bit more specific and you actually start talking about research. So what's the area of research that has looked at this thing? What are the main researchers in this area and what are they saying about this topic? Try to make that logical, that sequence. It's not an annotated bibliography, just one after the other. Try and weave them together into a story. Maybe there's one person who found this, but somebody disagreed with it. And then there was a third person who thought both of them were wrong. You can see how you can write that into a story, a narrative. And then while you're doing that, it may become apparent that there are some things that have been left out. There might be some gaps in the literature, things other people have overlooked, maybe things that people disagree on. Certainly in this heuristic topic we'll find not all researchers come to the same conclusion. So there's a reason we need to do this study. We need to clear it up once and for all. What's the answer to this question? Sometimes it's also the case that you don't necessarily need to find a gap, but you need to replicate findings. Psychology has a bit of problems replicating findings sometimes, so it doesn't do any harm to repeat a study and see, do we get the same or similar results? In any case, it needs to become clear why it is that you do your study. And then you need to say, okay, this is what we did, give an overview of it and your hypothesis. So then you get your method, and the method needs to include lots of detail about your participants, about the materials you used, what sort of research design, and what you did on the day to collect your data. You need to use the subheadings like this, not A, B, C. You need to just write that all in a paragraph, but you do need to use the subheaders. So as many details of participants as you have. In the first experiment, all we know is the number of people, and you know that they're from a student population. But for your own experiment, you may also collect your ages and genders. How did you recruit them? What kind of recruitment was it? Was it opportunity sampling, or was it snowball sampling? Was it random? You may have excluded some people from your analysis. Why was that? Maybe they didn't follow the instructions, or there was some other reason. So in the material sections, talk about your stimuli. Did you get them from a website? Did somebody make them? Was it a questionnaire? Where can we find them? How can we, if we want to replicate it, what are they? Where can we get them? How did you present these stimuli to your participant? Was it random, or did everyone get the same order? What other equipment did you use? Computers, screen size is quite useful. Did you use any recorders or pen and paper, etc.? The design is about the research design. Is it between subjects, within subjects, correlational, qualitative, etc.? Talk about your independent and dependent variables. What were they? Give them a name and specify what the various conditions were of the independent variable. What were the control groups, if you have them? We won't have any control groups in our experiments, but in clinical psychology you usually have them. If you have a within subjects design, how did you control for order effects? Again, we don't have a within subject study in this semester. It's all between subjects, so that would not be relevant. In the procedure, you describe what you did. When you were the experimenter, what instructions did you give participants? How did you collect data? How were the data scored, etc.? The results. The results are really brief. It contains the data, and that can be a table or a graph, or just the means and standard deviations in a written sentence. You don't need to have a table and a graph. It's either or. Make sure they've got numbers and titles. You need to write which statistical test you used and what you found with that test, and whether or not it supports your hypothesis. Now, in the results, it's a bit dull, but this is the only paragraph that you need to write. You can literally copy this, copy and paste it, and replace all the bold parts and put in the means and standard deviations of your study. So an independent samples t-test, which is the one we will be doing, applied to the data, and you will find out what kind of data they are. So choose the relevant one. Showed either no or a significant difference between the scores for a condition A, which has a certain mean, a certain standard deviation, and condition B, which also has a certain mean and a certain standard deviation. Then you get a T, that's a certain statistics, which I will explain to you later on in the practicals. It has a certain DF, which is degrees of freedom, which you put in brackets there. It has a certain value, and it has a certain p-value associated with it. Again, that will be covered in the lectures. In lecture number 3, we'll look at p-values. And then, in other words, the hypothesis was or was not supported. That's all you need. This and a graph is all you need. The graph should look like this. Again, replace the words in here with words that are relevant to your experiment. We will be doing the graph in the first practical once we've collected the data. So by the end of that week you will have a graph that you could just copy paste into your report. The discussion needs to include and it's the reverse. So the introduction was like that and the discussion is like that. So you start with a summary of your data. This is my experiment, this is what I found, and it supports or does not support my hypothesis. Then you broaden out to how does that compare to other research that I mentioned in the introduction. You also then need to summarize what you know and don't know as a result of this study. And even if you didn't find support for your hypothesis, you can still say something about this field. Maybe what it has shown is that this is a really difficult effect to replicate. Or maybe you know that the way you went about it was not the best way. There are always things you can conclude from an experiment. And then two really important things. You need to first of all make criticisms of your own study. What could you improve on it? That's something you really need to elaborate on. And then separately, this is different, talk about what you would be doing next to build on the findings. Sometimes, if something goes wrong in this part, it's usually E and F are taken as one thing. Your criticisms of your study are different to what you would do next to build on the findings. If there were no criticisms, then it would be easy to see what would you be doing next. What interesting things would you want to find out? You first have to make your experiment as good as possible before you can build on the findings. So these two are different things. At the end you need to have a conclusion, which is a brief summary of everything, a lot of everything, but a summary of your findings, and then there needs to be a take-home message. Something that makes the reader go, alright, so that's why this was important. There needs to be references, of course, in APA format. You don't have to, you can include appendices with maybe your stimuli or some other things that you want to show us. And there are some general points here about you're making sure it's in the past tense because it's something you did. Make sure you write concisely because you don't have many words, which you wouldn't have if you were a researcher trying to publish something. You'd have a really strict word count. Use objective language. Check obviously spelling and grammar. APA also asks you to number the pages and it needs to be neat and coherent. So when you've done all that, then you need to write the abstract. It goes first in the report, but you write it last. That's because it's a summary of everything that you've done. It doesn't include references. It's just a summary of what did you do, why did you do it, how did you do it, wow, this is what you found, and so what? What does it mean? Why is it important? It's meant to be only about 150 words, so this is really brief. And then you need to create a title. There are lots of dull titles in the world, so create something that captures our interest, something that entices us to read. So how will it be marked? Well, pretty much in the way that I just explained to you, all the things that need to be in there, we look and see if they are in there. You can also find a marking guide on My Aberdeen, which is the same one as your tutor will use. So you can see here what we're looking for in each section. So for example, the abstract, you can get 1 point or 0. 1 if it's all there, it's all relevant. 0 if it's only in part relevant. For the introduction, we're looking for, are you talking about relevant studies? do you mention the hypothesis, and is your introduction logically structured? In the method you get 3 points in total. We're looking for, are all these things mentioned, are they all correct? Results, again you get 3 points for that. Do you report the statistics correctly? Is your graph correct, and have you interpreted the data correctly in the light of your hypothesis? So then the most marks will come from the discussion. That weighs the heaviest. You need to correctly restate your results, discuss them in the light of the introduction, relate them back to the references there. Then you get 3 marks for discussing the limitations. So that's the criticisms of your own study. And then again 3 marks for suggesting next stages of research. So you get 3 marks for each. It gives you another indication that these things are different. Your limitations and improvements is not the same thing as next stages of research. Treat them as 2 different things. Conclusion, 1 point for that. References, 1 point for that. And in general, there's 1 point for a neat and coherent presentation style. So have a look at this when you're in the process of writing it, so you can check where you are. There are some frequently asked questions. For example, our class didn't find a significant effect. Will we lose marks? No, of course not. The quality of your experiment, of your report, doesn't depend on what results you find. It's about how you write about it. Because I don't know, I've never done this experiment before with a class. You're the first. I don't know what the result is going to be. The quality, your mark will never depend on your result. It's always about how you write it. I wasn't there on the day that the data were collected. What do I do? First of all, if you know any of your classmates, contact them and get them to explain to you what they did, and show you the data. All the data will be on My Aberdeen at the end of the class. Also, all the instructions for how to create the graph, which is what we will be doing in class, will be on the slides and on My Aberdeen, so you do have access to that. You should be able to catch up on your own. But please do contact your tutor if anything is unclear. You've only got 2 weeks to write this report, and we don't want you to fall behind. We'll be here to help. I want to make a start to get ahead. What can I do? Please do, if you feel like that. Well, the best way to start is reading about the topic of heuristics, and make some annotations about this as you go. That will help you with writing the introduction and the discussion. So I've got a few references here to get you started. Some of these you're going to have to find through Google because they're actually in textbooks. They're more general sort of ideas that you need to be familiar with. But have a look at these articles, summarize them, annotate them, so you have a head start when you come to write the report. I really look forward to help you on your way writing reports. This is where the fun really begins. So enjoy, and please, if there's anything unclear about this, get in touch with us as soon as you can. Thanks for watching.